Good evening, good morning, or good night, depending on when you're watching this. Today we're going to talk about multicultural therapies. Erica McLean, Eric Neely, and David Collins are presenting this material. So to get started, and thinking about multicultural counseling, very broad definition that encompasses a lot, put forth in the Encyclopedia of Counseling Psychology from Jackson, Yolanda Jackson in particular. The term multicultural counseling refers to a philosophy, a set of guidelines and recommendations for conducting counseling within culturally different clients, and a group of distinct approaches to psychotherapy. So our group focused on, obviously, multicultural counseling, and this broad definition, while at the same time becomes a very specific definition. The curiosity of, you could say, of multicultural counseling is that it is both broad and narrow. So for instance, there may be a specifically cultural technique geared towards a Japanese American where they would honor. And they may in particular talk about, familial bonds and honoring their ancestors. Or it could be so broad as to acknowledge that there is a difference between those we sit across from and those that we are ourselves inside. So this multicultural counseling becomes less of a technique in some people's view and becomes more of competencies and style. So the field really of multicultural counseling is blown wide open in the idea that it is both a theory and a style. And while those aren't exactly true, they hold true to a large part in that they both can be practiced. It is a theory and it has practicality in application. So not just knowledge, not just practice, but also what does that mean when knowledge, application, and cultural identity come together? So really the exploration, the analysis of what multicultural counseling is becomes a bit difficult to define. Define in that it's not just one mode in itself, although it is a mode. It's more like a style. It's more like a Rogerian, where some people argue that it is a theory and other people argue that it's not. And those people really have become pioneers in their own right. So moving on to some pioneers, Eric is going to talk about those.
The three multicultural pioneers featured in this presentation have been instrumental in changing psychotherapy. We have Lillian Comos Diaz, a Hispanic American. She was born in 1949. We have Beverly Green, an African American. She was born in 1950. And we have Stanley Sue, an Asian American. He was born in 1944. All three of these pioneers triumphed over racism, marginalization in their personal lives, and they have led the profession toward more culturally sensitive practices. All three of them came of age during the turbulent 1960s and 1970s, when mental health professionals realized that racial minority psychological concerns were being neglected. And so now we'll spend a little bit of time talking about each of them individually and how their upbringing impacted the theory. Starting with Lillian Comos Diaz.
Comos Diaz is a multicultural psychologist and she focused a lot on feminist liberation. And it has a lot to do with her upbringing, specifically regarding her grandmother and her parents. What I would consider a journey, literally. Um, but she has a long, tradition of healers in her family. So, for example, her paternal grandmother was what you would call a folk healer. And ironically, she was inspired by Catholicism, specifically the Virgin Mary. And ironically, again, gypsy cards. And she would invoke African orishas. It's also known as Orixa. And they're known as deities of the Yoruba, the people of southwestern Nigeria traveling to El Norte, the north. Now, her parents were basically immigrants, and they came from Puerto Rico, and they traveled, to the United States, and they settled in Chicago, of all places. And they tried to earn a living, which was difficult because they couldn't speak in English. Now, to make matters even more challenging, when Comas Diaz was born, she had an impediment. She had a physical ailment with her cleft palate. And imagine parents who have this, with newborn daughter. They can't speak in English. They don't know whether it's good to go to Puerto Rico and get help with people they know they can communicate with, or to trust these doctors in Chicago. But that's what they decided to do. So they, trusted the doctors in Chicago to be able to help their daughter. And more on top of that, the parents negotiated an experimental kind of a surgery. So it was a surgery that wasn't done before, at least at, this hospital at this time period. So there wasn't a lot of knowledge about the type of procedure they were doing. So they had no idea how things were going to turn out for their girl. But it worked out. And at the age of 6, Comas Diaz traveled back to Puerto Rico. So you have a woman who was born in the United States. She suffers with this chronic condition that does affect her. And then still at the formative age of 6, she goes back, well, for the first time, she goes to Puerto Rico, which is a culture shock. Now, right after Puerto Rico, she had realized the pervasive influence of culture on behavior, simply because she lived in Chicago and went to Puerto Rico. She could easily see the difference as a child, how culture impacted a group of people. So she grounded her identity as a wounded healer. And ever since then, she has opened up a center helping Hispanics of poor and low income. And she spent most of her time on feminist liberation. And now, um, the next person we'll be going over will be David.
Yes. So it's actually Beverly Green. She was born in East Orange, New Jersey. Her parents grew up in the Deep South amidst extreme conditions of American racial discrimination. And she was raised in a multi-generational household with parents, paternal parents, and then later maternal grandmothers and paternal aunts and uncles. And she also came of age during the civil rights movement. She graduated from high school barely a month after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and just weeks after Robert Kennedy was murdered. She attended college at New York University as a member of the first group of Martin Luther King scholars. And that was during the height of the protests against the war in Vietnam. Also, the Free Crusade to free Angela Davis. And Angela Davis was a Black woman who advocated for social change. And also during that time, it was the fight for women's rights. So Beverly's abiding commitment to psychotherapy was actually a tool for social justice. And it was fueled in part by her early experiences of racial discrimination during visits that she took to her parents' birthplace. Her parents' efforts to prepare their children for managing racism, and also the socio-political events of those tumultuous times. Green is a professor of psychology at St. John's University, and she's also a psychotherapist in private practice in Brooklyn, New York. Her scholarly works focus on psychotherapy with culturally marginalized clients, especially on the intersection of gender, color, and sexual orientation. She has a dozen of psychotherapy books and co-authored texts that challenge thousands of students each year to approach psychotherapy with more of an inclusive and multicultural attitude. And now we'll talk a little bit about Stanley Sue.
So, Dr. Stanley Sue, he was born in Seattle and 1944. So, just to place the context, so he's a Chinese American. His parents were immigrated into the States. And so that immigration was sometime earlier, and obviously in 1944, with the war just starting to close, there was tension, of course, towards, in particular, Asian Americans, even though Japan was more directly involved with the war, and all Asians were kind of lumped into one category at that time. So Dr. Stu was 1 year old in 1945, of course, being born in 44. And that August of 45 is when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed by America. And then that ended the war. So his formative years came after the war into the tumultuous 60s and 70s, in particular with the civil rights movement swayed Dr. Sue into clinical psychology whenever his original dissertation that he completed was in cognitive dissonance. He quickly migrated away from that once he started doing practical work, and he started looking into the mental health issues facing ethnic minorities. He was particularly taken by the minority communities, obviously being a minority member himself, and their disparity in access and the ability to gain counseling services. So he really focused directly and consequently eventually came to his own association that he founded, Asian American Psychological Association, in 1972. So still in some tumultuous times, as we know, Vietnam was starting up and war was in the backdrop once again. So there's a lot of sway, a lot of talk about all the ethnicities and minorities, and he is right in the midst of it, developing not only as a young person through those times, but also as a professional in establishing his career and his institute for the Asian American population. So Dr. Su has continued throughout the years, currently 75 years of age, uh, being a major influence in the realm of multicultural counseling, and then specifically has met a number of different times with the U.S. government and recommended policy, and was instrumental in creating a number of policies that would affect healthcare, in particular mental health care, being offered to ethnic minorities as a whole, not just in the Asian community, although certainly that was of interest as well. He has been active and is still active, currently teaching at the Palo Alto University in California. And that continuation of minority studies has been all throughout his career and current. So he has really set a lot of the landscape in the multicultural terminology and the way we talk about multiculturalism. So then moving on from Dr. Su, there are some assessments that show up in multicultural counseling in general. There are not as many common assessments, although there are a number of them, common assessments geared towards the client. There are many more towards the professional. In particular, the multicultural literature, at least uncovered by this budding researcher, suggests that multiculturalism is incorporated to all assessments, and assessments are normed and towards culture. One specific cultural genogram, another specific one for the client in particular is multicultural assessment intervention process, while it's a way to assess overall in process the cultural background of any given client. So those are a little more geared towards, but obviously still conducted and carried out by the counselor or counseling professional. There's a number of assessments that are geared directly towards a professional, conducting a cultural competence self-assessment. Race Matters is one of the assessments. Cultural competence of the health practitioner, all geared towards uncovering where a professional might stand, in particular in their own understanding of self culture and client culture and incorporation into the counseling process. So really, assessments become necessary, but a lot more broad in their scope towards the client and a lot more specific in their scope towards the professional. So for the next section, I believe Erica is picking us up again.
Yes. So with multicultural counseling, there is some effectiveness that comes with this specialty in this therapy, in these therapies. So conclusions reached in review of the literature on race and ethnicity effects in psychotherapy appear to reflect the race of the reviewer. For example, white reviewers tend to minimize the effects of ethnic differences, whereas ethnic minority reviewers tend to emphasize differences in the research. There are several robust conclusions that can be drawn. First, many racial and ethnic minorities are underserved in the mental health arena, and there have been an upward of 100 control studies that have concluded on culturally adapted therapies or traditional therapies that are tailored to improve the treatment utilization and outcomes of ethnic clients. We also have some criticisms that come with it, and these are just a few of them. So there have been fewer control studies that have been conducted in the United States on the effectiveness of psychotherapy with culturally diverse populations. Some research has failed to demonstrate that ethnic minority therapists achieve better or worse outcome. And that is despite some ethnic minorities tending to prefer ethnic similar counselors over European American counselors. Multicultural therapy also holds that psychotherapy is primarily cultural and imposes a rigid framework of racial politics, as well as there also seems to be some limitations in these therapies' integration of faith and spirituality when it comes to the client population that's being serviced. And so now Eric will talk to us about our first class activity.
All right, this class activity is going to be showing a live demonstration of multicultural counseling. So we see a Caucasian female therapist, including multicultural elements with her client, who happens to be a biracial woman. However, she is young, I would say around the late teen years, heading on to college. And she highlights just basic important elements from her childhood and how being biracial has affected her life, especially as it relates to maintaining friendships at school, how her friends and acquaintances, other peers at school saw her father when she had him come up to the school. For whatever reason, they didn't expect her father to be Black. And her mother is Hispanic. So they were surprised about the interracial relationship of her parents. So a lot of times in therapy, therapists don't use this. They don't tend to go over any topics of racism and anything that has to do with the culture. But the truth is that culture affects the human being, and how we're shaped, how we think, how we feel, and our actions, how we behave. So this video shows that. And just to give you a few statements that the therapist asks, she says, how would you describe yourself across dimensions that is important to you about who you are? How long have you thought of yourself as a biracial woman? Were you treated differently? What is your racial and ethnic background? The counselor reflects, right after the session, the counselor reflects on the session, and she states that the client is guarded and that, you know, it is her way of protecting her vulnerability. And that's exactly what um, our culture can do, especially if we feel like we are in a culture that's not accepted or it's not regarded as preferred. So there are three main questions that we will ask the students in this class. And it is, what was the counselor doing? That means the questions. Why did she ask certain specific questions and at certain points? What was her body language like? What was the tone of her voice? Was she empathetic? Was she curious? Did she come across as, I know everything about your culture? Or did she really want to hear about the client's story, the experience? The next question, well, we kind of went over this. What questions did the counselor ask specifically? So at first, we're asking, the kind of questions and what exactly they're doing, but specifically, why did she choose these specific types of questions? And why? Why did she ask about her ethnic background, and why did she put so much focus on, for example, the biracial element versus her being a female? So that's going to be the class activity, and it'll be a time for the students to be open and discuss. Right. So we're going to move in to multicultural awareness survey. It's known as the MAKSS, and it's a survey that's designed to measure an individual's multicultural counseling awareness, knowledge, and skills. The survey is 60 items, and it's divided into 3 subscales. Items 1 to 20 provide a measure of multicultural counseling awareness. Items 21 to 40 provide a measure of multicultural counseling knowledge. And items 41 to 60 provide a measure of multicultural counseling skills. The subjects who complete the survey are provided with 4 options in responding to each item. So they're answering each part with a rank from 1 to 4. So it's using a Likert type scale, with 1 being very limited or strongly disagree. A score of 2 indicates limited or they disagree. And the score of 3 is good or agree. And of course, the score of 4 corresponds to very good or strongly agree. And just to give you one example, I'll go ahead and share 2 examples. One would be, culture is not external, but is within the person. So then you would check strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree. And the same for the next question. One of the potential negative consequences about gaining information concerning specific cultures is that students might stereotype members of those cultural groups according to the information they have been gained. So those are just 2 examples of the 60 questions that are on the 60 item survey. And it's very important that these are answered as honestly as possible. That most accurate effect. So now we're going to get into the case study and kind of just look at an example of how this theory just really plays out.
So with our case study, we have the Jones family. In particular, we have Teresa Jones, 24-year-old African-American female who has recently become engaged to her boyfriend, Simon, who is a Caucasian male. Teresa comes from a two-parent household, middle-class family, where she's the oldest of a younger sister, oldest of two girls, and a seemingly pretty stable household with the focus being on family, career, and success. And so when she calls home and says that informs her family that she's engaged, family's very excited to meet fiance. However, she intentionally did not share with her family that her fiance was Caucasian. So what will happen in this case study will be a review of the family's interaction on first meeting Simon, particularly her father, him being taken back, his shock, and then his disapproval of their relationship, although it appears to be from a perspective of being an overprotective father, wanting the best, no one's good enough. It's not lost on the family, especially Teresa, the emphasis on Simon's ethnicity. And so in preparation for their upcoming nuptials, they decide to present to counseling to focus and address the father's concern with their relationship. So the case study will be read. There will be a video clip bringing the case study to life. And then there are 5 questions that proceed for discussion from the multicultural therapist perspective to include any additional information that may be needed to assess the family's presenting problem through the initial steps and ways in which the therapist can become and improve their cultural competency and sensitivity for treatment planning with this family.
So our overall class module is going to follow this outline when we introduce the idea of multiculturalism, just what that may be, what that may not be, how broad, how narrow, and facilitate some discussion over this concept of multiculturalism and therapy. Is it its own therapy, or does it couple with other therapies? Moving on from there, we will begin to discuss the theorists and some of their background, as well as their major contributions to the field of multiculturalism in mental health counseling. Moving on after some in-depth discussion of those theorists into the counseling demonstration that Eric would mention as the class activity, highlighting some of those in particular, and interventions, questions, and mentioning that survey, the second survey in particular, also would be for more of a para-class use for the student to understand where they stand under that counseling demonstration. Counselor competency will be discussed and exactly what that means or what that doesn't mean in the multicultural context, and whether or not, or what parts play into that, and whether it's not, whether just a technique or an overview or just what exactly that is in this competency statement. Practical considerations of exactly how this carries out, what it looks like when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and we sit down in a multicultural way, quote unquote, with our clients. Moving into the case study, in the in-depth analysis that Erica mentioned, proceeding out of the case study into multicultural inclusiveness, keeping in mind that it's not just about maybe skin tone and countries of origin, that multiculturalism really does encompass a lot more, down to even disabilities. And from there into the spiritual integration piece of maybe what God calls us to in the idea of being truly multicultural, and perhaps some highlights between the secularism of multiculturalism and godly multiculturalism, I'll wrapping up in a final conclusion with points to ponder, to take away with. So each of us, obviously, Eric, and David will have their contributions into this class module, facilitating the overall conversation of multicultural counseling. So thank you much for listening. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, or good night, depending on when you are listening to this presentation. Thank you again, and take care now.